Our first speaker of the afternoon sessions will be Paula Muhr from the University of Zurich, talking about the pivotal images of black holes and their epistemic power. Wait, Paula.
Thank you, Ellen. So my talk is based in the discipline of visual studies, or more specifically in the German version of that discipline, which is called Wissenschaft. So I will talk very much about what these images mean to somebody coming from this perspective, or perspective. My talk starts from this idea that there are increasingly diverse production contexts and uses of digital images across culture, and these have spawned intensifying debates among humanities scholars about the changing status of imaging. So there have been increasing calls, and I quote, for a radically new understanding of what images are doing to us and what we are doing to and with images. And as you will probably notice, there's not focus on defining images in ontological sense of what images are, but really sort of what they do. And in this context of these sort of debates, multiple theorists have developed very influential new concepts that have always emphasized this sort of novelty of certain digital images and practices with digital images that have emerged recently and are emerging, and always theorize them as a radical break with analog forms of image making. And I've listed them here, you can read them, but I will go into them shortly. And basically what I'm trying to claim here, and I'm really interested in how you're going to react to that, is that these currently influential concepts of what the digital image does cannot account for specificities of many of the novel scientific images, and paradigmatically for the EHC images of black holes and that functions within the scientific context. So if we look at these images in other contexts, in the media, mass media and other purposes, then we could apply some of the concepts that I will sort of talk to, but not when we look at them in. And
sorry, there's a, and I don't know.
I didn't take it. Give me 1 second. The first button behind you.
So basically what I'm arguing is that in order to do justice to the EHC images, we need context-specific analysis that acknowledges their novelty, but also, contrary to the other concepts, also aspects that these images share with older analog image making. And the structure of my talk is very simple. I only have 2 parts. So in the first part, I want to present the overview of selective overview of these currently influential concepts of the digital image, which on the surface might apply to EHC. And then in the second part, I want to sort of present my interpretation, which presents these images as pivotal images and that draws on more traditional concepts from series of theoreticians. And sort of through these more traditional concepts does justice both to the specificity and novelty of these images. And there are 5 altogether current concepts of digital images that I would like to discuss. First is so-called non-human photography, which was influentially introduced by Joanna Zielinska. She designates as non-human photography images that embody what she called non-human vision, so images that display anything that normally remains from human sight. And Zielinska explicitly applied this concept also to astronomical images, also to different kinds of photography, but not just photography, despite the name that refers to photography. So various other automated imaging processes, such as CCTV or even QR codes, that what she designates as non-human photography, and the defining aspects is that humans are absent from these images or just marginally involved as producers and users of these images. Another concept of digital images, which has been particularly influential, was developed by a German theoretician and filmmaker Harvey Farocki, who introduced this concept of operational images. And his concept has been referred to as operative and operational, and I'm sort of really sort of using this term operational here to differentiate it from other uses of operative images, to which I will also shortly refer to. Anyway, Farocki introduced this concept while discussing intelligent weapons that continually generate and analyze images of their targets in real time in order to sort of perform warfare. And as he really explicitly defines these operational images, they are neither made to entertain nor to inform, but just to monitor a process. And like the most important aspect, which is always sort of foregrounded when it comes to Farocki, is that in his definition, these images do not represent an object, but they're just part of an operation. So this non-representational aspect is, in a sense, these, yes?
Is it possible to monitor a process without being informed about the process?
Because basically, because it's done by machines. So it's just the machines that are monitoring a process, and the humans are completely sort of out of the loop or marginal in the loop. So that's a similarity in a sense to say that if machine can automatically generate images, analyze images, and perform an operation without the images, that's a sort of an operation image. And the human person is sort of unimportant, and also the visual aspect of the image is unimportant because the machine works at the level at the non-visual.
Suppose the image is just being used to align machine to another machine.
Right.
It's just going like.
Double standard, I would say the machine is informed and monitoring, the human is not informed and not monitoring. I think we would say monitoring but not informed, because in one case there's a hidden index for humans, in the other case there's a hidden.
Same one as the first. I mean, the point that there's always this implicit idea of this classical analog image, which is usually sort of made for human users by human users in some way. And this is sort of, in a way, this is brought to the sort of overemphasized in a way just to sort of make it clear that it's not for the humans. So the human doesn't have to look at the image for the image to perform its function. The machine does it on its own. And there are other, also much less influential concepts of operative images that do not posit this dichotomy between sort of operational and representational images. And these are the sort of kinds of operative images that I refer to, and will refer to some of them. The third concept was also developed by a German artist and theorist, Hitler Steil. So kind of interesting that these concepts, actually, Zielinska is also somebody who has an artistic practice in addition to her theoretical work. And this is a concept of poor image, which was sort of developed by Steil when she analyzed the circulation of digital images in the internet, on the internet, primarily focusing on low resolution images, which are typically a copy of some high-end image. And she sort of argues that these images are always shared, reformatted, re-edited, so they go through huge numbers of transformation, and that they finish just being sort of a blur. And although it sounds very sort of negative, when you hear this, for her, poor image is not necessarily a negative designation. It could also be something that has potential to sort of go against hegemonic structures. But the point is that, again, similar to the other concepts, poor image is not, I quote, about the real thing, about the original, but it's about circulation, digital dispersion, fractured and flexible. So again, it's about what gets lost in a sense. And more recently, Steil also introduced another concept, which is slightly related, but nevertheless also different. She calls it the mean image, and it was specifically introduced to designate the images generated by machine learning models. And there she also sort of foregrounds this non-representational aspect, that images are sort of no longer about referring to facticity or truth, but to probability. And she also sort of really says that these images replace likenesses with likeliness. So these probabilistic images are sort of not representational. The fourth concept was introduced by Hölzel and Marie, called soft image, and it foregrounds the visual fluidity of digital images, which was implicitly present in the other concepts as well, but here it's really sort of the main aspect. And again, it was a sort of concept that was derived from an empirical analysis, in this case of Google Street Views. And Hölzel and Marie argue that digital images are no longer about fixed visual identities, what they call hard image, but they're just sort of soft images, I quote, unstable algorithmic configurations of a database in the form of a programmable view. So it's no longer about solid worlds, solid representation, solid images, but continually malleable displays that are updated in real time. And they also sort of really strongly emphasize that production processes, how the images are being recorded, are no longer important, but just sort of what happens on screen is what matters. And the fifth concept that I also wanted to sort of bring into play, and that is maybe sort of becoming more influential lately, is the concept of invisual image ensembles by HP&C and Muhr. Again, this is a concept that was derived by discussing images that served as training databases for AI algorithms. And Mackenzie and Muhr argue that this invisuality, which is the neologism, designates, again, a distributed field of automated machinic operations, again, about what machines do, in which these algorithmically defined relations between images are what matter, and not sort of what images look like, their iconicity or their indexicality, which in this sense is relation to something outside the image. And the images in this case matter only as a mass and not as individual images. So it's just about the collections, and there's no clear distinction between human users and different types of sensors, machines, screens, databases. So everything gets amalgamated in a sense. And although each of these concepts, as I try to sort of emphasize, was developed through analysis of very sort of empirical, clear-cut situations, they have become so influential that other theoreticians have summarized their major claims. And some of the shared features have really sort of, in the meantime, become universalizing claims about the nature of digital images that are directly pitted against older forms. And I summarize these four aspects. So one is this automated algorithmic operations that underpin both the use and the production of images with less emphasis on production, where humans play no role or very marginal roles. The distinctly non-representational character of digital images, and this non-representationality is slightly under-theorized, because for some theoreticians, it just means that images don't look like the objects that they represent, or that they don't have this indexical relation, very sort of strong claim. But generally speaking, it means that images no longer have external reference, but just refer to themselves. And with this non-representationality, a related feature is this visual malleability. So they can have very different forms, and basically what they look like is no longer relevant. The visuality is sort of secondary. And the sort of fourth aspect that has become sort of more prominent in these later concepts that I presented is this loss of epistemic significance of individual images, and that images basically become more or less interchangeable, and that they just sort of work in groups, ensembles, networks. Now, as I said, I argue that none of these above concepts basically can account for the specificity of new scientific images, such as the HP images, and that none of the above aspects, these four aspects that I just listed and foregrounded, apply to EHT images that visualize immediate environments of black holes and are reconstructed from non-visual measurement. And to characterize the novelty of these images, I want to sort of propose this designation as pivotal images. And this designation should allow us to pay attention to the specific context in which these images are produced and used as epistemic tools. And in order to sort of draw that out, I base my analysis on Sibylle Kramer's concept of operative imagery, which basically just argues that visual inscriptions, and she doesn't talk about digital images per se, she just refers to any visual inscription as spatially organized 2D arrangements. What is sort of specific about operative images is that they open new spaces for interacting with objects that they visualize, and that their epistemic power, so their ability to do this, rests in the representational character, which in this case is not based on similarity, it's just the ability to refer to an external object. And also a second sort of primary feature is that they have to have a stable visual form. So basically, what I want to suggest is that the pivotalness of EHC images is that on the one hand, they constitute an entirely novel referential relation to black holes as physical objects, as there were no previous empirical images, and that they open up new possibilities of epistemic actions, but that for these possibilities, the fixed visual form is necessary. And this sort of establishment of referentiality is what I have tried to sort of show in this diagram that I developed based on close reading of the EHC articles, where I tried to represent the process of that production, in this case, sort of the initial images of M87 from papers in 2019, and drawing on, again, and sort of more classical theoretician of image, Bruno Latour, who argues that images never have to resemble their objects, but that they are constructed through referential chains, so through sequences of operations that linearly construct the translation of an object into its image. I try to sort of reconstruct what I call an operational chain in this case that establishes not just the production of image as the final product, but also referentiality. And what is sort of pivotal and very unusual about these EHC images is that if we look back at Latour, basically the defining operation of referentiality as a chain is its linearity. So you start from collecting data, then you go from one transformation to the second to the third, and at one point you arrive at the image. But in this chain, there are a lot of detours, there are a lot of multiple branches, there are a lot of parallel operations. So this is an entirely new way of working with images where there are a lot of breaks, a lot of sort of different ways. And two of the people present here have written about this parallelization in terms of robustness, which is sort of one way of approaching them, but another way of approaching them from the media studies perspective and the visual studies perspective is just to look at how these operations are structured and related to each other and how they sort of work. And another aspect of this chain, which is really important, is that along this chain, I don't have time to go into details, but I think that most of you are more than familiar with the individual steps. What happens all the time is this recursive hybridization of very sort of complex algorithmic processes and operations that model statistically the sparse measurement data. So in a sense, this probabilistic imaging that other concepts have been talking about, but all the time there's this hybridization with human expert judgment. And it's not just in this one phase of blind images, it's throughout the phases, throughout this chain, and how the chain itself is basically constructed. So which algorithms to use, how many algorithms to use, how many parallels are sufficient to do something. There's also constant use of model images, of static data that are sort of brought into relations to actual measurement data. And what happens throughout the process is that there's a massive production of less optimal possible images of black holes. So again, these sort of ensembles that we were hearing about in this other concept, but here, what I actually purport is that there's the constant semantic hierarchizations of all the images, because we have all these operations that establish images that are less probable, that are less optimal than top set images that are sort of better representations, and then sort of fiducial images and conservative images. So there's always this description of what counts as good enough or a better or a sufficiently good image. And this sort of assemblage of human and algorithmic operations, this amalgamation, is what then produces not just the fixed form, but referentiality, in the sense that this image then actually refers to some physical entity of a black hole out there. And sort of presented this diagram of this sort of branched out chain for the first initial image, but similar but not identical chains can be then reconstructed for the subsequent images. So for the images of our own black hole and for the sort of other images that the EHD produced. And the interesting aspect is also that this chain is then something that is dynamic and adaptive, and it has to be adapted to each black hole, to each new measurement, and also to the question, what type of image do we want? Are we interested sort of in the image itself, or are we interested in the polarization? And the second aspect of this sort of epistemic novelty is that through the fixed visual forms is what is the product of the chain, in sense, and what Latour has also referred to as immutable mobiles. EHC images stabilize the very sort of elusive phenomena, which is otherwise in this form not accessible, but they provide this new pivotal empirical access then to various physical properties of the visualized black hole. And what now can happen owing to this sort of fixed visual forms is that a variety of epistemic operations can be performed either directly on these images by qualitatively and quantitatively analyzing the salient feature. That's also like a point that not every aspect of the image is equally important. So it's also this way of working with images. Morphology is what counts, and comparison with simulated models can be performed because now there's this object that can actually be brought into relation, and operations can be performed that underpin this comparison. But also, even when the data are used themselves, so the data that went into the production of the images, and when during parameter extraction, various models are fitted directly to the data and not to the resulting images, it is the final image that has this particular morphology that underlies even this sort of retractive operations of going back to the data. So the fixed form remains as a sort of stable and defining feature of all these processes. And it is through these processes that the images then serve as epistemic tools that open up new possibilities of navigating black holes territory, generating new empirical insights into its physical characteristics, and testing current theoretical descriptions. And the point is also that the images don't just enable things, they also limit things. I don't have time to go into details, but it's always the kind of operations that can be performed and what is also visible in the images. And the final point that I wanted to make is slightly maybe hermeneutic and more like from a visual studies perspective interesting. But one of the things that I had in this list of sort of these characteristics of the new images is that the images lose their significance and importance in this ensembles. And what I want to argue is that here actually what happens with this gradually growing number of EHD images, significance of the initial images actually grows instead of decreasing. And I draw again on another German, in this case, media theorist, Ludwig Jäger, who introduced this concept of retrospective auratization, drawing or reinterpreting Benjamin. And basically what I claim is that by producing new images, the new images basically reaffirm the initial image's empirical authenticity, which was unstable as long as the images were just there on their own, didn't have other images that sort of confirmed the morphology. But also what happens is that with more and more images happening, the initial images become sort of the iconic, original, pivotal EHD images against which all the other images are sort of evaluated and controlled and compared. They're sort of like a zero in a coordinate system that defines the entire coordinate system. But that coordinate system becomes possible only when the other images are added to it. So this is just a short conclusion that I'm basically trying to argue against these universalizing claims about non-representational character of images and the lack of sort of importance of their visual characteristics or the human agency. And I have tried to show that what these images have done, EHC images, that they have transformed black holes from abstract mathematical entities into explorable, empirically explorable physical objects, and then these two aspects were sort of indispensable for this constitution of new referential relation to the previously inaccessible object, and the opening up of new spaces of epistemic actions which are performed on fixed visual forms. And I want to sort of suggest something which is maybe in my area quite dramatic, but I really sort of argue that these images and all the operations of their productions and use actually constitute a new cultural technique. Thank you.
We have about 4 minutes for questions.
Sorry.
No, no, it's fine. So if anybody has Zoom questions, please raise your hand. Otherwise,
It's a brief question on this comment regarding your images.
Mhm.
Yes, you're saying that they are produced by machine for machine.
No, I'm not.
You're not saying.
No, I'm not.
Okay. Because
Haruki said that, and yeah.
yes. Because basically the point is that there is a huge parallel discussion in AI studies. That's because whether it is produced by machine, but machine is programmed by human.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, that's what we mean.
Yeah.
Oh, I mean.
I'm curious about
I know the feeling.
yeah. So I'm basically curious about whether like the arguments totally work with the EHT images, but maybe the arguments will work equally well with like Hubble or JWST images, or maybe other like not necessarily astronomical images. At least when it comes to sort of like looking at those notions of digital images and universalizing claims and so on. I'm curious.
I would hope so. I would hope so that
What's your
basically this idea, but it would have to be sort of context specifically developed. But yes, I think that you could apply it, or one could apply it to other areas of scientific images, that scientific imaging have their own logic in a sense.
Mhm.
And that it would be interesting to sort of look at these specificities and what are the defining features of an image when it's applied. But like this idea that images can operate, they can operate in different contexts, and context really sort of determines what is important. But yes, it's not sort of like.
okay, so Jean, and
Thanks for doing this. You had this flow chart where you talked about the different averaging, fiducial, generating of
You
fiducial.
mean this?
Right, yeah, this one. So at the bottom, when you get these fiducial images, here you're showing 3 different pipelines from 2017.
Hmm.
In 2018, we had, like you also said, many other pipelines.
Hmm.
So when you generate these fiducial images or conservative images across years, and they're generated in different ways, pipelines are different. How comparable are they, and how does that then, like, does that directly, can you still, despite the non-direct comparison, you can't directly compare them, does that still add evidence for the 2017 image, for example? Does raise it, do you get more confident with the first image?
Yes, I would argue that you get more confident in the first image. Especially because you sort of introduce this variation, but you don't apply the same chain, but you sort of adapt your chain, and you still produce a result which is at the sort of visual level comparable. That's really sort of a reaffirmation of your.
Would you think that doing the exact same analysis on the 2018 data and showing the same some sort of image is also a necessary step in this process, or that's not necessary?
I don't think it is. I mean, in a sense, where I come from this sort of visual studies analysis, my aim is not to make sort of normative claims. I'm not trying to sort of understand or to claim that something is good or bad. I'm more interested in the processes that generate. But from my point of view, sort of this variation is what makes it actually a cultural technique. Because you can always adapt, you can always do something new with it to produce new effects, to look at new things. So that's what makes it so interesting from my point of view. I would never argue that it's normative, but I argue that it becomes richer and that it produces more interesting and richer effects through this variation. Otherwise, it becomes a static kind of thing, and I would not call it a cultural technique. I would just call it a process or a chain. But this sort of additional level is this variation that you introduce.
We can defer this to later discussion, but I like very much the prosecution of the chains that you develop here and the mix of human and algorithmic and statistical and specific. I found the joining of this to a sort of digital version of Benjamin by
Giga?
a bit unpersuasive because I mean, even the EHT images are themselves the result of a long chain of images. So assigning quality or equality to one of the many published images in the first papers seems not necessary for the argument.
That's why I sort of didn't put it as the main argument, but more like an epilogue.
Yes.
I mean, that was really sort of an intentional kind of thing.
I
But
like
it's
your
not part-
argument more than I like that.
Well, it's also, Jäger doesn't argue about the images themselves. Jäger argues about sort of Voratization and things like that. But that's also still my argument. And I think there's also an additional element of Voratization, which sort of you performed in a way,
Mhm.
if I read it correctly. I mean, you donated the image to MoMA, right?
Yes.
And that's like an absolute gesture of Voratization of any image that you
We're done for that.
There's nevertheless this, but yeah, I would really like to talk to you about that.
We'll come back to it.
Okay,
Okay, I think we should cut it here.
thank you.